Thank you so much for being here today, Kamau. I always enjoy the opportunity to learn from you, and I'm so excited to hear more about your thoughts on this topic of soul care and health equity, and just I'm really looking forward to where this conversation takes us. So thank you again for being here.
And thank you too. I'm looking forward to engaging around the subject and exchanging and learning some of your perspectives too as well.
So I think just to start, I'd like to ask you, what is healthcare equity and why is it important to you?
I think healthcare equity is part of a large conversation, body of knowledge, a process, practice that addresses imbalances that show up in healthcare, but that are also connected to larger societal problems, marginalization, racialization of people that leads to systemic imbalances. But we're focusing in on the healthcare experience and different levels, right? There's like policy level, there's practice levels, clinical processes even, and then the interpersonal aspects. The soul care aspect is focusing in to our common humanity and our potential as human beings in this endeavor to take away, to identify blocks to good healthcare, or blocks to good healthcare, things that hinder people from receiving the best care and health as possible.
It's interesting to think of it kind of as soul care, right? I think we talk so much about self-care, and just thinking about taking that step back and really looking inward, and how do we fill our cups, not just for our physical bodies, but for our emotional and mental bodies as well, to help, really be able to take care of our patients and their families and really be present. When I think about healthcare equity, I can't advocate for my patients. I can't be my best self if I'm not taking care of my own soul and my own self to be able to do those things for my patients. And when I think about healthcare equity, you've touched on so many of those aspects of it, but really just making sure that their voices are heard, and to be able to do that, it's hard, difficult work, and it can often bring up uncomfortable pieces and topics for people. But you can't have that openness if you're not taking care of your soul as well. And so I think, again, like I said, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation and able to talk about some of those things. Mm-hmm. So, you've touched a little bit about soul care and how it's related to healthcare equity. What may be helpful for me is to hear a little bit about what are some key components and elements of soul care itself?
Yeah, I think it's a new topic in healthcare, something that we're developing as a conversation. And we start with thinking about language. Self-care versus soul care, or self-compassion versus soul compassion. We know that self-care is important, but soul care adds another dimension. So as you were saying earlier about filling your cup, what does that really mean on a consistent basis? That we have that word meaning, actually, pausing, being intentional about how we show up in the world. What intentions do we form? Are we conscious of those intentions? I like to root things in a lot of my conversations around compassion. Well, we have this idea of compass, COMPASS, compass. So the first intention is compassion. And taking like an example of what does compassion have to teach me specifically today before I even focus on others? So I can ask myself right now, what does compassion have to teach me? It's about maybe courage and joy today, to have courage and joy. So like for you, for example, if you think about what does it bring up for you in your heart, or as you think about it?
I think, for me, maybe compassion would be like openness and learning. Yeah, I think like you're saying, it can mean different things on different days. For me today, though, and I think for the past few weeks, it's been just having this openness. I feel like I've been learning a lot, and been in situations where I have to think about things in different perspectives. And having that compassion requires me to have openness to hear those things.
Yep, exactly. So to make that a regular practice, to be a student of compassion, and opening up the language to say on a soul level, all right, you get this immediate response inside. So that's the compassion piece. Then you have authenticity, right? Authenticity is sort of an alertness to what's real in yourself. Might be fear, it might be hope, it might be the way that you perceive your interactions with people and adjust your intention to connect with other people's authenticity, connect with your own. So it creates this realness, rootedness. So combining compassion and authenticity, I think, is healthy for human relationships. Then the final one is safe space or even sacred space. Pausing to think about, how do I establish safe spaces, combining compassion, authenticity. It's a balancing act. It's a dance. We all have our boundaries and limits, but we can extend ourselves with people to really get into their space, to understand where they're coming from. So do we create spaces that are psychologically safe, socially safe, culturally safe? So that's something that we have to work with, all these themes, for example, to study and develop our character, develop our perceptions. So that might, help in terms of thinking about soul care practices. Everyone has to sort of develop their own understanding of that. But I think just like flossing your teeth or taking care of your basic physical hygiene, if you neglect your internal hygiene, your internal well-being, then, we get burnout and we get cynicism, quote, behaviors that project on other people. So we start like assigning blame, for example, when really that might not be the most helpful approach for a situation. It creates more suffering for self and others. So these are some examples.
I think you're touching a little bit on what I wanted to ask you next of, what are the benefits of soul care? Not just for us as practitioners and medical providers, but also what are the benefits for our patients?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's this principle to think about what's subtle defines what's more dense or more obvious. So our intentions, our awareness, like how we put things into context, shapes relationships, shapes speech, shapes our perceptions, how we behave toward other people. And when we internalize like being soulful as opposed to self-aware, but also aware of like your deeper self and being able to connect with people, oftentimes, historically, people have been have not had access culturally or linguistically or in certain systems, and we're constantly rubbing up on this alienation. We have opportunities to bridge that by building relationships that go beyond purely like physical symptoms or physical presentation. There's a story with people, there's a history, there's a depth that people can either be seen and respected or sort of like ignored or neglected. Just adding that into the process of caring for people, the process of thinking about procedures or policies and practices, I think that that element is something that is an ongoing important topic to work through.
The piece that really resonates with me is what you said about burnout, and how not taking care of our souls leads to more burnout, among other things. And I think that then affects our ability to care for our patients and just really being able to see the value of each human that's in front of us and the stories that they have to share, and being able to really connect with them, not just on a level of I'm providing medical care for you right now, but also like just connect as humans and be able to learn from one another and hear each other and form that partnership in that care.
Huge, huge. And I think it ties into sort of like best practices that people may think about. And it's not something that we're just going to have overnight. This is like, how do we build this into our culture? Like you're talking about the benefit of having a soul care concept built in that, you know, over time we develop more competency with knowing ourselves, knowing how to relate to other people, partner with people, empower people, while at the same time giving our best medicine, giving our best, you know, our best recommendations or our best practices, but in partnership with people. And how do we build that conversation up and practice?
You know, I guess my next question is, how does soul care lead to more equitable healthcare?
It's a good question. I think it's a question that we're all going to be continuously wrestling with. There's no black or white answer, no pun intended. But there's this idea of in clinical settings, we get into situations that things just don't feel right, or they bring up fear or anxiety or a sense of alienation or dissonance. And that's a signal that something's missing here. There's a theme that's coming up that is interrupting good care or a flow of care. And oftentimes that can be assigned historically, assigned to the patient. You know, it's something that we can see sometimes that, oh, this person is just not cooperative, or they are being difficult or aggressive or whatever it might be. But there may be a deeper wisdom and a broader picture that you're working with. And I think when we talk about or think about soul concepts, that can include when it's the inner self of that person, the stories that they have, like the daily experiences. All these things inform how people show up. Ancestral stories that are passed down intergenerationally. And we're in a culture that sometimes just is only looking at the very surface of things, and we miss a whole lot that can help us relate to people and to connect with people and have meaningful connections with people that are enriching and satisfying. That includes the direction of care, but it's almost even beyond that too. But it includes the practices of what we're doing in a healthcare setting, but it also transcends it in a way. It's like that human connection.
We've been talking a lot about kind of the experiences of these marginalized, oppressed communities and populations. And it can be a really heavy topic. Like, you know, we've been talking about some really heavy things. And how do you deal with that? Like, how do you incorporate your soul care into topics that are so heavy and can bring about discomfort and sometimes shame?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I had like one answer, but a couple things come up. Like when you're attending to your inner self, when you're attending to the things that may be heavy, it's not always going to be a pretty process. It's going to be an uncomfortable process. But that can also lead to deeper levels by challenging ourselves, like deeper levels of connection may come up. You know, deeper authenticity, back to this idea. I think authenticity, you know, shared authenticity, shared compassion, shared safety leads to sort of like a lighter space. It leads to a sort of hopeful space where possibilities are there that you didn't see before. So there is this idea of, in a way, when this discomfort or this sort of heavy themes start coming, in a way, we can mentally say like, oh, opportunity, you know. We don't have to take it as like, oh, here we go again. What's the opportunity here? And in a way, that's where bringing in like the health equity consult service could be helpful to go and deal with that stuff that's heavy, that's just not being dealt with, that's not being thought about, reflected upon. it's going to come with challenges. It's going to come with courage. But I think being willing and courageous enough to go into certain spaces will allow for a lightness to come about eventually.
I like that idea of courage being part of your soul care. You know, I think it's hard to sometimes kind of really think of yourself, putting yourself into those positions where you intentionally are going to be in the uncomfortable spaces and where you're hoping to, learn. I think like that growth and that learning comes with having that courage to want that. And if that kind of makes sense. And so it's really interesting for me to kind of hear you talk about it in the sense of being courageous to learn these things and having that courage to sit in that discomfort. My background is in palliative care, and that's something that we often talk about is like having to be in these really uncomfortable situations and just being able to sit in that discomfort and learning through that discomfort. And it's interesting to me to kind of think too, like for me to be able to be in that space of discomfort, I have to have the courage to be in that space of discomfort. So, I think I'm also really hopeful that the more we're able to put ourselves in these spaces, that we are all going to be able to have more growth and learning and take care of our souls.
Yeah. I think about there's this, when it comes to this idea of the inner being of a person, making space for that spark of wisdom to come out. It's like we're talking about uplifting human dignity, right? Reducing suffering. And on one hand, we see when people adjust and people feel heard, I think you've experienced it, like they really do brighten up. They really do appreciate, they have gratitude, right? That gratitude comes about, that feeling the love comes out, right? That feeling the respect comes out, and it lightens the burden for them, right? And people can be part of that process by slowing down, by reflecting, by consulting, getting out of the comfort zone for a purpose. It's not just to sit there in the suffering. It's to listen and look for that spark that is such a great part of being a human being, And so there's so many dehumanizing factors that we learn along the way in life, but recognizing those, okay, but what about the humanizing factor? What makes the care that we give or the hospitality that we can show sweet for people? Hospitality is like a huge aspect of soul care, I think. Because self-care is okay, taking care of your physicality, but then there's the soul care about how do you honor people? And how's that good for you? How does that enrich you to honor people's space, to honor people's perceptions for a while? Expands you, I think so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you talked about how when you do kind of sit down in that space of discomfort with patients or with other people just in general, and you're really truly having that open conversation and learning from it. Sure, maybe it starts out uncomfortable, but then it becomes this space of gratitude and learning and lightness and connection. While we've heard from so many patients, having that space has been valuable for us. I feel like for myself as a practitioner, it's also been really valuable for me, and I think brings meaning to my work that I can have that connection and really just kind of slow down and be able to really take care of my patients from all aspects, not just from the medical aspect, but all of the spiritual aspects, the psychosocial aspects. And I think that's, for me, that's one of the main things is where do I find the meaning in my work? And how do we get there?
Exactly.
And it sounds like a large part of that is soul care.
It is. It is. It's like building it in. It's not something that we could just do once in a while. It is, even if you journal, again, ask yourself the question, what does compassion have to teach me today? Or we have for example, the virtue cards that I email out to a lot of people. It gives you something that you can hone into. Courage transforms fear into determination. That's the first line. It transforms. So I might have fear about something, but if I have courage internally to practice compassion with myself, to have insight in myself, and then just go into whatever it is that's uncertain, but learn, grow, and believe in possibilities, right? Believe in what's possible of making a better connection with people, whether they be clinical or they be, clinical staff that you're part of your team, bringing out that authentic things, pointing out the elephant in the room, or with patience, being able to listen, being able to slow down and connect, and how that can shape the course of the outward care, right? Because you've connected, now you're sharing space and thinking outside the box, or not just reacting, but you're actually having intention with people.
How do we cultivate that courage? How do we cultivate that curiosity to bring that meaning into our work?
The way that I think about it is, when you get into like the inner qualities, right? That inner aspect, what do people like thrive off of? What do we thrive off of? We do thrive off of connection. We do thrive off of compassion. We do thrive off of joy, meaning. And so that light, in a way, bringing that light to yourself or engaging yourself in the realm of ideas or virtues that, we share through the cards, for example, the virtue cards, like immersing yourself in courage or the idea of practicing fairness. It gives you like this light that sustains you, that gives you sustenance, really. And so if you make that part of deepening your life, because we're all going to go through vulnerability in life. We're all going to go through some burning process. We just don't want to burn out. We want to, I don't know if I want to say burn in, but
Burn slowly.
Simmer. So this idea of like love, for example, like in many traditions, there is this burning that happens. It's like the candle burns itself to give light, but it's not like about, just flogging yourself. It's about deepening yourself so you can bring more to your life, more to your practice, more to your home life or your clinical life. And we find with certain people who have been in the field for a while, there are just certain people who do more of that and they can cope. And I'm not saying this is easy, because look at the world, look at all the divisions in the world, look at all the contradictions that we've inherited in this age. We didn't make this stuff, but we inherited it. People have inherited the dynamics. People have inherited the disparities. Okay, but what can I do inside to heal? What can I do inside to cultivate determination? To do my part. One person counts. Making one clinical success or adjustment can mean that for 50 other people, can mean that for 100 other people, but it has to start with that one. And then another one, then another one. Otherwise, the big picture can be so overwhelming. Cultivating your practice, cultivating your soul care practice is good for you and is good for whoever comes in contact with you, I would think.
So for those folks who are perhaps not as versed in soul care as you are, for those who are wanting to start caring for their souls, what are there resources out there? Where would someone begin in starting that journey?
I mean, I think there are clues all around us. There are answers all around us. It may be our spiritual traditions. People wrestle with that sometimes. What's authentic? What do you resonate in your spiritual tradition? What is the wisdom that you grew up with that helps cultivate how you find peace, how you find value in life, how you find virtue in your life? But a lot of it starts with this intention, right? That's why we go back to Compass, compassion, authenticity, safe space as one example. But it starts with the intention. I want to resolve something that's been bothering me internally. So it can mean so many things. That's the thing. For some people, it's therapy. For other people, it's journaling. For other people, it's finding a good book with quotes, poetry. For some people, it might be reading a scripture every day. But you have to find, and it may evolve, it may deepen, it may grow. But there's so many books, we have some different books here as examples: self-care, self-compassion workbook for teens, nonviolent communication. These are all things that address intentionality and how do we communicate with ourselves, how do we communicate with others. And that's an ongoing struggle, effort, but hey, you can either neglect it and be miserable or try and work through it. You're worth it. It's like the idea, you're worth it, other people are worth it. So that diminishing of worth is something that, we have to be intentional to reverse. We have to be intentional about it. It's not going to come free, but it's so valuable.
Yeah, I think about the ways and maybe in which I care for my soul. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of oh, these are things that I do, but I never necessarily considered them soul care. When you're talking about reading a book, and to me, it's oh, I'm reading a book for fun. But then I think, when I think a little bit deeper about it and really pause and reflect on it, it's I'm learning, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I'm learning about the experiences of other people. I'm learning about the ideas and the experiences that the author, put into that book. And so I think perhaps maybe folks are doing soul care and not even knowing that they're doing it, but it's that intentionality, right, of being intentional about doing the self-care and the soul care that really, again, I'll go back to what I said before, fills your cup. And how do we do that?
Yeah, it's this literacy too. We often focus literacy as something being external, how to read a book or how to study a particular thing or talk about a particular discipline. But there's also this literacy of our relationship between our intentions, our states of emotion, our states of mind, our states of behavior, our bodies, how we treat our whole being, that you can also, because human beings like to progress. We like to win as human beings, but how do we win in this game of the soul, or this project of cultivating our being? Mm-hmm. That's a progressive thing where our neurotransmitters are being shaped. Our neural pathways are being shaped. Our whole being is being shaped. You think of elders who are just really attractive because they've been doing this all their life. They've been overcoming things all their life with faith, with determination, with good character, with love, with compassion, and it shows up in their being, in their entire being. So it's a progressive thing and a literacy that each of us can cultivate. And I encourage myself and other people to make a lane for yourself. How are you doing in your soul? If you're weary, if you identify, start with the compassion. That is huge. Take compassion as a teacher for 40 days, right? And then, mark that. Where are you now than you were 40 days ago? Oh my goodness, total different outlook.
I've enjoyed this conversation so much, and I feel like just sitting here in your presence helps me take care of my soul. But I think my last question for you is, what haven't I asked you that would be important for folks to know about soul care and healthcare equity, and what are you hopeful for in the future?
Well, I think the reason I'm pausing is because the subjects at hand are so expansive. They're so deep, but also accessible. So I think it's a thing about, if people stay intentional, if people believe in sort of that principle that if you care for yourself and your soul, it's good for the universe. It's good for, it will lead to answers that we didn't know before. It'll lead to solutions that we have been untried. And that's an exciting thing. That's an amazing victory in a way. And although the problems of the world may seem insurmountable, intimidating, if you, in your own space, can get that connection and literacy about who you want to be, how you want to show up in the world, who you're becoming, and you can see that having an impact, right? That creates encouragement, that creates motivation, momentum. There are other people who are trying to do this work from different disciplines, different angles. You'll probably become in alignment with those people. You'll recognize those people. There are subjects all around us that can be frightening. Like our history, people are struggling over hearing other narratives of history. But if we bring it down to a smaller level and say, like, how can I honor people? What can I learn from people's experiences? How can I connect authentically with people's experiences to help them? Or to to truly bear witness on the dignity of this person, to bear witness to their courage, to bear witness to their humanity. You know, this is enrichment that I think is, how do you say? You can't put a price tag on that. And because we're in healthcare, although we have historical, like some really wild history when you start digging into healthcare of this country, there's also this idea of the language, health, care, equity. Like, go into the meanings of that. And we're not gonna always get the answer right, but at least be curious about how to implement the meanings, because there are really important meanings behind health, behind caring, behind being equitable. Taking that road of meaning and experience is really important. So there's a lot that we can discuss, and I hope that hospitality, those things are there, those meanings are there. Don't take things for surface and granted. Be curious. And medicine is an art. It's not just a hard science. There's an art to it. There's a discovery, there's a social aspect, there's a spiritual, emotional aspect. Hey, let's engage and see how we can be better.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
And, look forward to many, many more conversations.
Yes.